Welcome to the Herpcore History podcast, presented to you by Little Shop of Horrors. Feel free to reach out to us on any of our social media platforms for any of your feeder needs. All right, let's go ahead and get into this episode. All right, today I'm lucky enough to be joined by Mr. Troy Hibbitts. How are you doing today?
Just great.
We've had some weird weather lately. It's been quite warm in the days. I don't know how it's over by you.
Yeah, so it was 80 today, but 2 weeks ago I had 18. So weather in Texas in the winter, in South Texas, you just never know.
Yeah, it's always vast swings. Well, where did you grow up at?
Well, when I was very young, we lived in Louisiana when I was really little, but I don't remember that. We lived in East Texas from the time I was in about I didn't go to pre-K, but that age up until second grade, and then my folks moved away from East Texas to the northeast of Dallas Fort Worth. It was at the time a little town called Wiley. Wiley, when we moved there, had just won the state championship in football. They had about 300 kids in high school. When I graduated from high school there, we were about 600 students, and now they have two big high schools, and it's just a part of the general Dallas-Fort Worth metro area. But that's where I grew up, up that direction, northeast of Dallas.
Yes, sir. Gotcha. So you kind of been in Texas for any of your life that matters to kind of shaped.
Yeah, I was born in Texas. I was born in College Station, and my dad had a degree in wildlife and fisheries. We lived in Raymondville for a few months right after he graduated, and then he got an emergency teaching certificate to go teach in Louisiana, and taught there for 3 years before they moved back. He moved back to Texas. So I have a few years in Louisiana when I was very young, but just those vague childhood memories of throwing sycamore balls at each other and stuff like that.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Well, when did your interest in reptiles start?
Well, Dad had snakes. So I've been around reptiles all my life. Dad had snakes when I was a baby. So my interest in reptiles just came naturally because we had snakes. Dad was when he was a little kid. They lived out north of Abilene on a ranch. His dad was a ranch hand, and his older brothers kept a menagerie of whatever they could catch, which included snakes and turtles, but also crows and raccoons and bobcats and all sorts of things. And then when he was in junior high, they moved to Arlington because his dad had a cousin that ran a construction company, and so he moved to town. They moved to the city for job opportunities, and so Dad growing up in Arlington had all these memories of his older brothers keeping their menageries of stuff, and the only thing he could keep in the yard were basically things he could keep in cages. So that was turtles and snakes, basically. And so he had turtles and snakes when he was in high school. When he went to college, his turtle collection went to his in-laws. Actually, my dad and mom married right after they graduated from high school, and his turtle collection was in my granddad's backyard. That would be my mom's dad, not my dad's dad. His parents didn't have a big enough yard. So I grew up around snakes. I catch the turtles every time I went to visit my grandparents. They all had names, Spotty Dotty and Big Black and Big Brown and stuff like that. Then when we lived in Brownsboro, when I would have been kindergarten-ish, we lived out on a rental property out in the country that had about 100 acres around it, that had a bunch of junk on it. And Dad just let us run loose on the place, and let us catch snakes. But he told us to only catch Sterarea, he didn't call them sterarea, brown snakes. He called them decay snakes and earth snakes. They were the only things we were permitted to catch because he knew that we could tell that they weren't copperheads. And there was a lot of copperheads on that place. I mean, that was over by Athens. And I remember flipping a piece of tin and on that property, and that was within earshot of the house, but Dad was mowing the yard that day, and I flipped this piece of tin, and there was a prairie king snake under it, as it turns out. And I knew it wasn't a copperhead, but I knew I wasn't supposed to pick it up, so I put my hand on its tail, and I started shouting at my dad, "Dad, Dad, Dad." Well, he didn't come because he was mowing the yard, so I just picked it up, carried it back to the house, and he says to me, he says, "I told you not to pick up anything that wasn't a decay snake or an earth snake." And he said, "How did you know it wasn't a copperhead?" I said, "Because copperheads have bands with an hourglass shape on it, and this has got blotches on it. So I think this is a rat snake." He said, "Well, you're close. It's a prairie king snake." And so after he realized, I guess, that I could, in fact, tell copperheads from other snakes, he basically gave us free rein. So I was 5 or 6 and had free rein to pick up pretty much whatever I wanted. And but we had in that house, Dad had some tiger salamanders that he'd seined out of ponds in the Panhandle. He had Great Plains rat snake that he caught on a field trip up in the Panhandle somewhere. He had folks. We'd go to Florida on camping trips, and he had folks from Florida that he'd met in Florida from Tennessee that sent him a black rat snake and things like that. I mean, he had a few things. He never kept a lot, but he had a few snakes. And then my brother and I had an aquarium full of sterarea and earth snakes. And then when I caught that prairie king, then my brother had to go out and catch something, and he caught a speckled king, and we kept those for a while. So that's my start, in snakes, was because Dad had snakes, and Dad had turtles when we built a turtle pen in the backyard at that place. And one of the times we went to Florida, he caught a gopher tortoise and brought it home when it was legal in 1975 or 6 or whatever it was. And he had his box turtles in the pen and the gopher tortoise in the pen. And when the gopher tortoise dug out the burrow back into, it actually made it to where the box turtles could escape from the pen. So very shortly we had a pen with a gopher tortoise in it living in his burrow, and no box turtles because they'd all escaped through the hole that the tortoise had dug.
Well, how interesting, cool, to start off with the base that you did with so much knowledge, right? That your father was someone that was very educated in it and spread that passion to you guys, and also to kind of I would guess, the methodical outline of it.
Well, he was at some time while we lived there in Brownsboro, he was the president of the Texas Herpetological Society. In his 20s, he was the the president of the THS rotates. There's that you only serve for a year, but he took us on the Texas Herp Society field trips from about the time we were 5 up until we still go on the things. A lot of those old timers have memories of me when I was knee high. So, I talked to Dave Hillis at UT, and he's like, "Yeah, I remember your mom and dad bringing you guys to meetings when y'all were just knee under waist height, and we'd go on those field trips looking for snakes and stuff when I was very young. So I grew up with kind of a professional bent to the Herpetological Society, going to field trip meetings that had a lot of college folks bringing their college classes out, and Dad brought his high school classes out when many of those trips. We, as I aged up and got more interested in the actual science side of things, I'd sit in on the symposia, where people graduate students present their research and that sort of thing too. So, yeah, that's kind of my origins in herping. It was all things like that. We did family vacations. Um, Pretty much every family vacation we ever went on with my dad and mom had something to do with herping somewhere. If it was going to Florida, road cruising in the Apalachicola, or going to Utah looking for collared lizards and leopard lizards and um, Great Basin and midget faded rattlesnakes, things like that.
Yes, sir. Yeah. How cool is that? And what a cool experience to have, and so unique, right? Where so many people kind of trickle in and find their own way into the hobby, and you run into people, or just by happenstance that they run into someone that is very well educated and interested in the hobby, and the than the averages, the family that just tolerated it. But to come from such a wealth of knowledge and be there for such a fundamental building of this hobby, how interesting is that? And to get to see it expand.
Well, yeah, it's weird too, because when I tell people things that people that when little kids in the car play license plate alphabet games, or finding billboard signs that start with whatever, all the things you do to distract your kids in the car. Ours were the scientific name game. Try to stump dad on a scientific name. Things like that. Um, so. Um, it got to where I had to learn scientific names of birds and stuff to stump my dad and my brother on scientific names. So we'd be getting the field guides out, and if I said Plethodon glutinosus, they knew what it was, or Plethodon cinereus, they knew what it was. So I had to venture outside of the southeast. So then it was Plethodon vehiculum or Hydromantes brunus, and then those are all the things that everybody knew. So we knew all the scientific names of all those things. So when I dropped Passer domesticus on them, that was a big ooh, I won, right? Because nobody knew what Passer domesticus was, which is the house sparrow. So
But again, what a rich environment to grow up in, of just knowledge, and having just right your siblings and your family around you, where it's just this constant adventure for knowledge and trying to gather more, and to have that base to build on. It's just so cool, right? Where that's something where many people, myself included, well, I've always had an interest, but to be at that level at such a young age, it came with time, So just to be building on that from the beginning to where you are now, how impressive, especially with what you went on to do later on. And so, but not skipping too far ahead, but so you're there, you're a young man at 5, 6, you're herping, you're going, and you're getting to go to these symposiums and learning and just being around all this knowledge. What were your early days of field herping like when you got a car and you were able to go on your own? What were the things that you were excited about?
well, when I first learned to drive, we lived in so Wiley is at the time, it's in the Blackland Prairie, and there's a lake. There's two lakes east that are by Wiley. There's Lake Lavon, which is on the north side of Wiley, and Lake Ray Hubbard on the east and south side. And Lavon has Corps of Engineers land all the way around it. And when they built the lake, the government, when they built it, they basically condemned a bunch of old farmsteads and ranch property and stuff around the lake, and there were lots of old barns. There was a one big dump site that where people had just it was kind of an informal spot where people had just taken a bunch of stuff and dumped it out. And occasionally you'd find a new spot where somebody had just had building material that they'd dump on that Corps of Engineer land. And so a lot of my earliest high school individual herping stuff was was getting in the Ford Escort wagon that my grandparents gave us. That was their old car, and driving around on that to that Corps of Engineer land around Lake Lavon, looking for. You could find milk snakes there, prairie kings, speckled kings. A few places on the very north end of the lake you could find copperheads, and a few places on the very south end of the lake you could find copperheads. But racers and coach whips and speckled kings and Texas garter snakes, things like that. I'd take that old Ford Escort wagon down some pretty rough roads. I recall one time taking a road that it was pretty wet that spring, and I took it down this road that I'd never been on, and it's just started getting muddier and muddier, and it was to the point where I basically couldn't turn around. The road itself was somewhat dry, but the margins of the road were mud, and Blackland prairie mud is super sticky. If you get out and walk around in muddy Blackland prairie mud, you're going to be caked giant masses of mud on your shoes and stuff. So I basically knew I couldn't turn around, and I made a bend on the road, and right in front of me was this tore up. Somebody had been through it with a 4-wheel drive and dug the place out. It was a giant mud pit, but I could see pavement on the other side, where the county road joined up with one of the farm to market roads, the paved roads there. And so I thought, well, the only way through this is forward. So I gunned it and skipped across the mud. I mean, good thing a Ford Escort wagon, 4 cylinders, front wheel drive, and doesn't weigh a whole lot, because I plowed right through all of that, managed to not get stuck on the other side. So, that sort of thing was what I was doing when I was in high school.
Yes, sir. Yeah, that is a young man's adventure, right? Where
Yeah,
now you would
we
look
did.
back and go,
We did take one trip my senior year. We took friend. You had Brian Box on the other day, and I don't know if he told stories about Scotty Laughlin, but Brian and Scotty had been friends for a long time, and Scotty's mom had just moved to Wiley to teach there, and I think Scotty was still in college. He was in college up at Midwestern, I guess. But when they found out we were into herps, and him and my brother and I and Scotty went to South Texas. It was the first individual road trip that we took. We went down to Hebronville and Falcon Dam, and road cruised our way down Highway 16, and then down to down some of the roads by Hebronville. I think we slept at a picnic area somewhere. We got pulled over by the police somewhere south of Tilden. The police officer pulled us over and says, the reason I pulled you over is because that guy in the back seat kept looking back, so it looked real suspicious. It's like, well, you were kind of tailgating us. We didn't know what was going on. Said somebody got in a fight in Tilden, and so I was out checking you out. And I said, his early experiences with law enforcement when you're trying to road cruise for snakes, and so I'm sure he thought we were drinking or something. Why else would a car full of high school kids, be driving 35 miles an hour down a state highway at night? So,
encounters with law enforcement
yeah,
always end up it's always kind of difficult to explain what you're doing, where it's like, well,
right.
this is what I'm doing.
Particularly when you're outside of the general herping areas. I recall getting pulled over one time when I was in high school with my dad. We were coming back from Arizona, and at the time when I was in high school, we tried to keep a lot of lizards. We had an idea that we would have we'd build an outside cage to keep Scolophorus in. So we had a ton of lizards. This must have been 86, 87, and we were coming back from Arizona, and it was a thunderstorm in the Davis Mountains when it got dark. So Dad said, let's go road cruise down here in the Davis Mountains for a little bit before we were going to get a hotel in Midland or Odessa, someplace like that. So this was back when I guess road cruising was just barely legal at the time. I think it was 87. And so we're cruising down Highway 17, and it was a really good snake movement night. We found several subocs and Emery's rats and garter snake. We found a gray band that had just been clipped on 17, just south of the Scout. And right after we found those snakes, the game warden pulled us over, and man, he started searching everything. I mean, he never even got to the king snakes we had in the bottom of the box of snakes. I mean, I had a Splendida I'd caught in Arizona, and we showed him several lizards, and it's like, what's this? What's that? And then he opens up the dad was always worked with the science side. He was always preserving things, making specimens and stuff. And so in Arizona, Texas horn lizards are legal to pick up. At least they were in 87. And he had a preserved road-killed horn lizard in there. And the game warden says, "Oh, y'all are fine, I guess, except for this horn lizard you've got here, and that you've got preserved. That's illegal in Texas." And Dad says, "Well, I picked it up in Arizona. I can show you my gas receipts that." He kept all of his gas receipts back in those days. I can show you a gas receipt that says I was in Wilcox this morning. And the guy says, "Well, that don't matter to me. That if it was up to me," this was one of the old time game wardens that was not very snake friendly back in the 80s. He says, "If it was up to me, you snake hunters wouldn't be able to come out here. And if I wanted to, I could write you a ticket for the bug in your grill." Um, we basically just, he said, "Okay, fine." He let us go after keeping us on the side of the road for 30 minutes or 45 minutes, and then let us go, and we just drove out. But yeah, encounters with game wardens, I remember the begin, when things were a lot, that encounter was probably my worst game warden encounter, but that was back in the day before they were, after things had just come off the T&E list, in the 80s, when they weren't real fond of, hang on a second, the dog.
Yes, sir. Not a problem.
Dog wanted to go inside the bedroom.
Not a problem.
Yeah, back when things had barely come off the T&E list, and so he was accustomed to writing people tickets for looking for snakes, and didn't like the fact that he couldn't do it anymore. So, so game warden's fun, law enforcement.
Yeah, it always it's an added. I will say the benefit of it is on a long night when it's just not going smooth, it will sure wake you up. Where I'm awake for the next few hours and I'm good. It's better than a cup of coffee, getting those red and blue lights turned on you and going, "Oh, well, okay, something's going on here."
Sometimes, if it's border patrol, it's usually pretty educational. They'll talk to you. They want to see what you found. They want to tell you stories. And I'm like, and that sort of thing. Sometimes you get pulled over by somebody and you can tell they're really green. That I got pulled over on Highway 9 in New Mexico. I was driving from El Paso to the Chiricahuas one night. And I usually, if it gets dark on me in El Paso, I usually take New Mexico 9 just on the off chance I'll find something interesting. And I'd pulled over to photograph a desert king, and I had the snake in my hand. And this gal pulls up beside me and lights me up. She said, "What are you doing?" And I said, "Well, I'm stopping to take a picture of this snake in my hand." I've shown it to her. And she's like, "It's really dangerous here." I said, "What do you mean?" I said, "I've driven this road hundreds of times, and occasionally I see an illegal run across the road, but they don't want to see me." She said, "No, but there was flooding out here." It's like, "Yeah, it's okay." It's like, "Have you been here very long? You've never seen a snake hunter?" So, yeah, I had border patrol in Arizona one time that we were hunting green rats on Mount Hopkins Road, and going back and forth on the road. And we got down to the bottom, and one guy lit us up, and when he did, my wife pulled over. She was the driver that afternoon, that evening, and she pulled over. And when she pulled over, the wide spot in the road was actually a Forest Service road, kind of, that went back into the desert, or a Jeep road that went back into the desert. And when she pulled off, they thought she was going to try to ditch them by running down that Jeep road. And suddenly there were 2 or 3 cars. I didn't even see the extra ones, and they were all like, "Yeah, we're going to run from us." I said, "No, we were just pulling off to so that you would stop us." I mean, actually, they hadn't even lit us up yet. I just knew that they were game law enforcement, so I just said, "Well, let's just pull over and get this stop over with, so we can get back to Herping." And when we pulled off, then they lit us up, and it wasn't just one car; it was 2 or 3. And when they realized we were snake hunting, they just kind of let us go. And then that was in May, and then in late July or early August, I was in the Patagonias, cruising one of the roads there, and I saw the Border Patrol guys cruising, so I drove up beside them and stopped and leaned over, and I said, "Hey guys, I just want to let you know I'm going to be snake hunting here." And one of the guys leaned up and said, "Hey, didn't we stop y'all over on the Hopkins Road back in May?" So he recognized our vehicle.
That's so funny. It is funny how I've definitely experienced that, where that's my similar move. Because, often, right, I get it. They're doing their job, whatever. But I'll be driving and they get behind you and they're going to follow you for 3 miles, 4 miles. And it's just like, okay, let's get this over with. Let's go. And then pulling over, no matter what you do, it's going to be, what are you doing? Why'd you do that? And so I've experienced that many a time.
Yeah.
It's like I've
I
been
just want to
here
get
so
the
many
stop over
times.
with so I can get back to what I'm doing.
Yeah, once they tell you like, oh, snake hunter, or I like when they pull up and they go, hey, I told my supervisor it was snake hunters, but I had to come. You're snake hunters, right? Yes, sir. All right, thank you. And they go back. That guy was just trying to chill that night. Very funny, very funny. And usually, they usually try to be helpful individuals to whatever extent they know or don't know. That's
Yeah.
always interesting. Well, yes, sir. And so, early on, you're talking about, finding gray bands in the mid '80s. What was that like early on? What was the community like? Just overall, what do you remember from that time or early on gray band hunting?
Well, so like I had mentioned that Dad was a member of the Texas Herpetological Society, but we were back in those days. There were also usually a lot of local herp societies, which have basically been killed off by the internet. But we were members also of the Dallas Herp Society, that then kind of died off and morphed into the North Texas Herp Society. They were actually, at one time, there were 2 groups. There was the Dallas one and the North Texas one, and the North Texas one was in Fort Worth. And when the Dallas Herp Society died, but folks like Dave Barker that were at the Dallas Zoo at the time, he took us. We could go to the Dallas Zoo and drop in at the zoo on pretty much any given time, and Dad let them know that we were coming, and just go up and knock on the door in the herpetarium, and they'd open it up, and let us go in the back. And I recall being really keen on the gray banded kings and stuff that they had there. Such to the point that Dave, I guess it was something that they produced at the zoo, but they gave us a pair of babies one year. So that was my earliest experience. And then watching people bring snakes in. This kid moved down from New Jersey. His name was Ken Magnuson. He moves down from New Jersey, and the first time he went to West Texas, this is a kind of a mix of a Barker story and Ken's story himself. He goes to West Texas, and he's sitting in Comstock, and he calls Barker on the phone and says, "So I'm out here in West Texas looking for gray bands. Where should I go?" Dave says, "Where are you at?" I said, "I'm in this little place called," and he cups the mic on the phone, looks outside and at the signs and stuff. "I'm in this little place called Comstock." And Dave's like, see that road across the road that goes north right from where you're standing? And he said, yeah. He says, drive that road tonight. And Ken went up and caught, I forget if it was one or two alterna. One of the luckiest guys out there, right? To get first time he's in West Texas, he doesn't even know where he's at, and he goes up Juneau Road and catches an alterna. He did the same thing that his next trip out. He went to Big Bend and was cruising. He didn't catch an alterna, but he caught a blonde sabak on his first trip to the Hibbitts, cruising the river road. And so I remember seeing those stories. And of course, at the time, things were illegal to catch alterna. And Dad being involved with some of the herp societies and stuff, he was a little leery of having things that were illegal. Dad's very he's a lot more law abiding than most, right? And so even when Barker had given us those those zoo bred alterna that we had, Dad didn't keep them very long because he just was uncomfortable having something that was illegal there. And then in '86 we went to Juneau once and didn't find much. And then he went out. That summer, I'd gone on. That summer, I went and worked for my aunt and uncle at a pizza place. They had a Pizza Hut. My uncle had a chain of Pizza Hut restaurants, and they'd invited me to come up there and work for them. Summer job, right? And that summer, Dad went snake hunting on the River Road with a fella from Arlington or from Dallas. And they caught a River Road alterna, probably one of the least attractive River Road alternas I recall ever seeing. But it was just a real dark, kind of muddy looking alterna phase, and I didn't get to go on that trip. So Dad had that snake, and then the next year, when things came off the T&E list in '87, we went to Juneau. Langtree, and we slept at the Shumla picnic area during the day or at night. Dad was never one for staying out till all hours of the evening. I think the latest that we stayed out on that trip was probably 2:00, and we found a DOR on Juneau, and then that same night we caught a little male Blair's. And then we went over to Langtree from Juneau and cruised over there and found a DOR near the picnic area, near that Shumla picnic area. That was a great big snake, medium dark Blair's kind of a thing that had been smashed by a semi. And then the next night we caught a gravid female dark Blair's up on Pandale Dirt. So that was the first time I went out and actually found alterna. It was probably my second trip to the Trans-Pecos where we were looking for snakes. And then that same year we found the DOR in the Davis. It's actually the only year I found more than one DOR alterna in my alterna collecting history. Was the first two DORs in the first trip, two DORs and two live ones, and then another DOR a month or so later, 2 months later in the Davis Mountains. I've never found more than one DOR in a season since then. But that was what, in those days, Dad didn't spotlight because he didn't want to draw attention to us. There were a few people spotlighting. There wasn't anybody walking cuts in those days. And Dad was a confirmed road cruiser, which is why we hunted Juneau most of the time. 90 was narrow enough that you could road cruise it too. The traffic hadn't decimated the roadside populations, and you'd see snakes crossing 90, which you don't a whole lot anymore. You see an occasional snake crossing the road on 90, but certainly not on that stretch from Langtree, from Comstock to Langtree. I very rarely see anything on the road out there anymore. We weren't basically just road cruising back and forth, which is why we hunted Juneau. Tire testers would come through every hour and a half with 6 or 7 cars in tow. Zoom, 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 zoom up and down the road. They'd go down and turn around just south of Baker's Crossing, and then turn around and zip back up. There was a tire place up by up between Sonora and El Dorado. There was a tire testing facility up there where they test tires, but for some reason they sent cars down on a real highway as opposed to just running them on their track that they have up there. And of course, killed a lot of snakes. Tire testing, 6 cars in a row zipping back up and down the road. And then I didn't find another one until after I'd got married in 91. I went on several trips. I went out there several times. Found lots of other snakes, but we didn't find that was like 87. I didn't find another one until 91, right after maybe 2 months, 3 months after I'd gotten married. So
That's kind of the weird thing of Alterna, right? You hear of a good friend of mine has a story of his first trip that he went out there. They stopped at a cut in the road, and he opened up his car door and shined his light out the window, and there was an Alterna.
Yeah.
And then it took him, I can't remember how many, years to find another one, but it all seemed so easy in the beginning, and then the real pain started.
Well, in retrospect, I wasn't terribly persistent. I road cruised way too much. In 89, I worked for Jim Dixon at A&M, had a project studying concho water snakes as part of the mitigation for the putting in OH-Ivy reservoir. And he had a study site out there, and I was a field assistant on that study site. And one of the graduate students from Sol Ross that came out to visit had caught an Alterna on Juneau, and so I was keen to hunt Alterna. And one of the times I would work 10 days on, 4 days off, and one of those 4 days off trips, I went out to West Texas and cruised around, but I was looking in weird places, and I hunted northeast of Van Horn one night, and then I'd bounce over to another place a different night. Which now my strategy is not to bounce around. I don't bounce around. I go to one place and I stay there. And then in 90, my wife and I, she was my fiance at the time. We went out for about a 5-night trip to the River Road, and we took one trip to Juneau and saw other people catch Alterna. But we did too much stuff during the day. Sightseeing or whatever during the day and messing around, so that we'd get tired too early. Then we went to the River Road for 5 nights, and everybody but us caught an Alterna. The best snake I caught was a lyre snake. And then in 91, we went out. Marla and I, we'd been married. We got married in May of 91, and then we went out in July and started. We were working at a pizza place in College Station at the time. So we had, I think we had 4 nights that we could go out and we hunted, but we went to Blackcap. We hunted Blackcap for 4 nights and didn't find much. And on the last night, one of the guys said, "Go buy yourself a spotlight and go to 277." Said, "You can hunt." I was 21, so he said, "You can hunt until midnight and still make it back to College Station to go to work." And so we did. We're cruising on the narrow stretch of 277. Back in those days, from about the South Picnic area north to Buffalo Creek was a 2-lane, not a 4-lane like it is now. And it was, and I road cruised because that's what I did, but I was spotlighting a little bit. And as we came up the hill of Loma Alta, there was a really light colored snake in the road. And I didn't have the best lights or anything on that old car that I was driving. And I didn't know that it was an alterna at first, but my wife, I guess, had twigged that it was not a rat snake. And when I jumped out of the car to catch the snake, they kind of driven past it, pulled off the road. She leaned out with the spotlight and lit it up on their highway. And there's this super nice light phase alternamorph laying in the road there, crawling across. And man, I was excited. So, to have gone several trips out without catching one, and then to catch basically my dream snake, which is, I've always liked the alternamorphs better than the Blairs. So yeah, that was really cool to do that, particularly after having, spent 4 nights out. And so then we actually caught that alterna and 2 lepidus that night, and then bailed at midnight and drove back to College Station, got there at 4 in the morning. And then I can't remember if she had to be at work early or if I did, but one of us had to be at work at like 11. So we basically only got about 4 hours sleep, 5 hours sleep once we got home, and then had to go to work, pizza place stuff, what you do when you're in college still.
How cool. And how cool is that I'm also lucky enough to have a partner that enjoys field herping and is a motivated field herper, but to get to experience that with someone where, that shared passion. And for my wife, it wasn't her interest she knew she was into until we did it, and then she's like, oh, okay, and I want to go in before she wants to go in,
right.
And my wife's a go-getter when we get out there. But what a cool experience to have, and to have a partner like that. It's very cool.
Yeah. That she's less enthusiastic about going out now as she was back then. But as long as we've got a spot, what she likes to do these days is hunting the Davis, because usually the Davis cools off early enough that you don't really feel the need to stay out till the sun comes up. And so, if I take a Davis trip and we camp at the state park, she's all down for that sort of thing. Usually, she'll want to go out and, we'll camp at the state park so that, and then if I want to stay out late, if I'm hunting, one of the, part of the reason why I hunt 118 a lot is that if she gets tired, it's easy enough just to pull into the campground, drop her off, and then go back out and hunt for another couple of hours. So,
works out for everybody.
Yeah.
That's how you work a long-term relationship.
And then you hang out and sleep. Hang out in the hammock and read books during the day in the shade of the trees. It's not too hot. So she'll hunt that way. Now she is not game on when I want to go hunt the Wacos or something. Where or the quads where I in the Wacos, I actually, when I hunt up there, a lot of times I just sleep on the side of the dirt road that runs north on the east side of the Wacos. I drive up and find a spot pull out on the side of the road, sleep on a cot beside my car, and then when it gets hot in the middle of the day, I hang a tarp off the side of the car to give me shade, and sleep in the heat in the shade of the car off and on all day. She's certainly not down for that sort of adventure, but it's part of the issue of wanting to hunt different places is that you have to accommodate different strategies and different camping things, and I'm just I just don't see the sense in getting a hotel most of the time. And besides the fact that I actually sleep better on a cot in the breeze or on a hammock under the trees than I do in most hotel rooms. So I don't know. Hotel rooms I just never sleep well in the things. Even if I'm really tired, I would just be waking up. So it's better for me to be out somewhere where I can just nap and nap off and on in the shade in nature than it is in a hotel room with the AC drying everything out, or I always end up congested sleeping in a hotel room. I just it's just a weird thing about me and hotel rooms. I just don't like them. So I usually, if I can, I try to sleep out, but that does sometimes limit how long I can hunt. Like if I go to Black Gap, I usually don't go at it for more than a couple of nights in a row, just because it's so hot down there during the day. A lot of times I'll sleep on the side of the road down at the Gap, and then when it gets light, starts getting hot, then I'll wake up and I'll drive to Marathon and sleep at the post park down there under the cottonwood trees for the afternoon, and then drive back down to the Gap to hunt the next night.
Well, and I think that speaks to how hardcore you are as a field herper, because so often I sit here and I get to listen to people's stories, and usually it's people recanting on, when they were 18, to their, maybe early 30s, and the hardcoreness of going out and camping and putting the work in. And I go, "Oh, but I wouldn't do that anymore." And I go, "I've never done that. I've always been a little sweet boy about it, where it's like, oh, hotel, that's where I'm going to be staying." And so to hear that, you're hitting it hard, consistently for the beginning to where you are now, that's pretty cool and very admirable.
Well, when I remember that Motel 6 used to be $29.99 a night, and then I pulled into a Motel 6 and in Van Horn or something, and it's or try to get a hotel in the Bend, and the cheapest one that you can find is $100 a night. The only thing that mitigates being able to go to the Bend and staying at the Christmas, for example, is when you get a group of 5 or 6 guys renting one of the cabins at Wild Horse, and you're splitting it up and you're making it relatively cheap. I just don't like spending. The gas prices are what they are, and everything. I just don't like spending the money too. You know, I've got it, but I just don't like spending. It's like I'm going to spend the money on a hotel.
Well,
Like, yeah.
and that's why you got it, and that's good. It's a good little gem of life advice there. I think throughout this conversation, you've if people are listening and actually paying attention, there's a lot of valuable information that you're dropping in just your passing conversation here. That if this is an invaluable conversation. And that's even one of those there where it's just the way you think, and it's your overall mindset that adds to your the wealth of knowledge that you are, and that's something that later on in your hobby and as you evolved, you went on to do with some of the books that you've written. What was that like for you? What compelled you to do that, and how were those experiences?
Well, the first field guide that we did was Texas amphibians, and this was kind of born in conversations between Dad and Jim Dixon. That Dixon and Whirler did Texas snakes, and they were like, well, Dixon was like, amphibians is wide open. Nobody's done a book on just the amphibians of Texas. We've got Texas snakes and the Texas monthly field guides on reptile that Dave Barker had done, that was basically the reptiles of Texas, that was everything excluding snakes. Because Alan Tennant and did snakes of Texas, snakes of Texas, and then Barker did the reptiles of Texas exclusive of snakes, and then Dixon and Whirler did with UT Press, they did the Texas snakes, and so there was that field guide, and so there had never been an amphibian one, and so Dixon was talking to Dad and saying, you ought to do a Texas amphibians guide. And so Dad says, well, sat down with me and my brother and said, let's do this Texas amphibian guide. And then we found out that Travis Ledoux, who's at UT, and the late Bob Tipton, who was a herp guy that we all knew each other. So Travis and Bob were going to do Texas amphibians too. And so once we found out that we were competing, we all sat down together and said, let's do this. Let's do this as a collaboration between all of us. And Bob is like, well, I've already got a lot of it written. And it's, well, the way Bob's writing technique or style was to basically take everything that had been written and put it all in paper. So Bob basically copied Conant and Collins and some of the other accounts on all these species accounts and just had it compiled like it was here's the information. Now we need to take this and put it in our own words, condense everything, throw stuff out, add to it, whatnot. And so that's where it was our starting point once we decided to collaborate. And then originally it was, we'll take each species account and then share, I'll write it, we'll pass it to Dad. Dad will pass it to me, and then I'll pass it to Toby, and then Toby would pass it to Travis, and with Microsoft Word and markup so that everybody could see who had done what edits and stuff. And then, unfortunately, Bob developed pancreatic cancer about this time, and was unable to complete the project. Now, if you look at that Texas Amphibians guide, it says Bob was the lead author. And that was basically us giving it to him, because he didn't live to see the completion of the project, but we put him as the lead. The actual lead author on that one was my dad. He probably wrote about 70% or so of the material in there, and then me and Toby and Travis had our contributions in there. And so then we got that published, and I come out of that experience with the feeling like we had too many cooks in the kitchen. And so I said, well, I want to do Texas lizards, and I'm going to do it by myself. That was my original thought. And then my brother calls me up and says, hey, I'm the one that actually studies lizards in Texas. He had projects on dune sagebrush lizards, and he's had projects on Crotophytus reticulatus, the reticulate collared lizards. He's had projects on spot-tailed earless lizards and stuff. He says, I'm the one that's the lizard biologist. I ought to be involved in this. I said, all right, fine. That's fine. I'll write. I'll do parts of it, and you do parts of it. And we divided up the species accounts. And as it turns out, what I would do was I would write the species accounts with some reference to some of the other ones that have been published, but I left out, I'd write in, whiptails, Texas spotted whiptail has an activity pattern where its peak activity is from this temperature to that temperature. And I would leave that blank with the numbers. And then I'd say such and such, and I'd say, the activity pattern is for this month to that month, and I'd leave the months and stuff blank. And I wrote each of my species accounts that I was responsible for with holes in them deliberately. And then as it turns out that I actually had done all of my species accounts, and Toby he'd done one or two, a handful of them. And so I went ahead and wrote on his species accounts. Now, that's not to say he wasn't contributing, because I left deliberate holes in my species accounts because he had access to the university and the research database that it's hard for me to access sitting at home here in Brackettville, without a lot of stuff a lot of herp journals and stuff are behind the paywall, and the data is behind paywall. So as it turns out, what we did with that one was that I wrote the bulk of the text, and he filled in all the science and smoothed things over, and then he sent them back to me, and then I smoothed things back, and then we basically had the final product. And he did the bulk of the range maps. And so we got that published. And then I was keen on go ahead and rounding out the herps, right? Because there was still Texas snakes, the Dixon and Whirler book, and then there was the amphibian book that we did with Bob and Travis, and then there was me and Toby's lizard book. And I went ahead and wanted to do turtles and crocodilians, and so I was going to do it with my dad. And the funny thing about the way we approached that one was that Dad basically had 1 foot inside of the 21st century and 1 foot that was still back in the 19th century, 20th century, whatever. Because he wrote everything out on paper. I said, Dad, do the outlines and send them to me. You outline each of the turtles. I wanted to include a discussion of the turtles that are in the different river sheds in Texas, and so many turtles are aquatic. And I had him outline everything. And he outlined everything on a legal pad. And then he scanned it to PDF and emailed it to me. And then I would open up, at my house, I've got 2 computer screens. I've had 2 monitors forever. And I put one monitor with his legal pad PDF and the other monitor with Microsoft Word. And I would write from his outline that he'd put in PDF file that he'd written. It was handwritten on a legal pad. And then I would write it up and then send it back to him for critique and review and that sort of thing. And we cranked that one out in about a year. I did both of those. The first, the amphibians guide with 5 authors, 4 ultimately, took us 2.5 years to do. The lizards book took a year, and the turtles book took less than a year. I work really well under a deadline. I don't work very well without a deadline. I'm still the Jim Dixon's Amphibians and Reptiles in Texas book, the one with the dot maps. I'm toiling away at that one, but it's an A&M Press thing, and they don't send out contracts. They just take your books when you're finished with them. I've been assured that they'd publish it if we finish it, but I've also kind of been waiting. The revision of Texas snakes, I was lined up to do that one. UT Press wanted me to do it because I'd just given them 2 field guides with a year, with a real quick turnaround. And I wanted to do the revision of Jim Dixon's Texas Snakes, and both Dixon and Whirler at the time had passed. And when UT Press had to ask the estates of Whirler and Dixon, and Jim Whirler's family didn't have any problem with it, but Mary Dixon, Jim Dixon's widow, they had a close relationship with a fellow that's now at what do you call that college that used to be Southwest Texas? It's Texas State, the one in San Marcos.
Gotcha.
And they'd had a close relationship with him, and she wanted him to have the field guide. So she let him do it. She had him do it instead of me. She kind of said, no, I want Mike to do it. So they had Mike do it. And so that if you go look at the UT Press guides, you'll see that one's has a different format and a kind of a different feel to it, a different read to it. And in fact, he's a co-author on there, but he left the Dixon and Whirler text mostly intact. I would have altered it to make it in line with the other 3 guides in the series. But my brother tells me that Dixon wrote in his copy of the Amphibians and Reptiles book that the book was his. And he said that he didn't think that there would be any dissent on us taking on that book. But I've also kind of been sitting on the back burner. And it's, like I said, I don't have a contract with that one, so I haven't really plugged away at it. It won't be hard to do, given that I've already written species accounts for most of the herps. I still just need to write the snake accounts, and I'm about halfway through with the snake accounts on that one. But my workflow is not as I'm not as intently focused on it as I was on those other guides, because part of it's because I don't have a contract to do. I just work better with a contract. So.
Yes, understandable. And so, that's something that's very interesting that you brought up, is talking about, what you would do differently, and what would you account to the style in your writing and what you're trying to get across. What are your influences in that you think about when you're trying to purvey the information that you are?
Well, it depends on the kind of, certainly these are guides for um, for 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 educated laymen. They're not if I'm writing a guide, and the ones that the UT Press series guides are educated lay guides. um, I try to they have more information in them than does something like the old Peterson, Conant and Collins guides. There's more stuff in there, but it's not a technical thing like you would see with a ton of references. Um, I try to keep it approachable, and I want the factual stuff to be accurate, and I want it to be have detail in there. Now, if we do the amphibians and reptiles, the Dixon's dot map guide, which we're working on, or that I've been plugging away at off and on, because that will include every species in Texas. The species accounts will be a little bit more threadbare. I mean, I won't put as much stuff in them. Now, that original guide that Dixon did had minimal species accounts. I'll have more in it than that. But you have to hit a balance on those sorts of guides because of if you put everything that you want to put in there, the book will be, you know, it'll be a tome. It'll be a giant volume that you have to do in a multi-volume set or something. You know, if you do, and I know that basically, I know Bob Hansen has you interviewed him about their California guide. He'll be able to put more stuff in that California guide than he'll be able to put in the Princeton Field Guide version that he's doing for Herps of the West. He just won't, unless he makes that guide super thick. He's probably not going to be able to put as much information in that guide that he did as his California guide. And so you have to strike a balance. Now, when I write for the local newspaper, and I put a weekly science corner thing here in the Kinney County Post, that one I try to keep it as factual as possible, but I also try to make it very approachable, whimsical and uh, light, and I'm a little more folksy, when I write for the local paper, targeting whoever it is that actually reads the thing. I don't know. I get people around town that say they'll enjoy it. So, and sometimes, and I hit all sorts of topics in that thing. I had one that I talked about genetically modified crops and stuff. And one of the ladies, I have her two sons in class right now. She said she wrote a letter to the editor saying that she really appreciated them running the Science Corner because she had been afraid of GMO foods and crops because she didn't know what it was, and that me writing that article in the paper allayed a lot of her fears about it, because I talked about this is where it's a concern, this is where it's not a concern, and that sort of thing. So it's a different audience, where you're trying to strike an audience to be informative, but you also don't want to lose anybody with what you're covering. Uh, and so again, you want to target your audience, but you also don't want to overwhelm anybody. And then you also have to strike a balance when you're writing a guide that's got hundreds of species in it, that you can't put as much stuff in there, as you might in a smaller guide.
Yes, sir. Yeah. No, and how interesting, and then definitely that's something I will definitely be checking the newspaper stands when I'm cruising through those areas on a trip out to hopefully try to snag one of your science corners. What a cool little gym to have. I'll keep an eye out for that in the future for sure.
Well,
Well,
if
how cool is that?
you're on my Facebook, you can see I post them fairly regularly. I just posted the one that got published today. Um, so you can see them, screenshots of them anyway, on my Facebook.
Very good. I'll have to follow up with that for sure. Facebook has a weird way of what they show you and who they
Yeah,
don't show you,
you
right?
never
So
you never know what that goof. I get so frustrated with that platform when you I like a discussion thread to be oriented from first comment, the next comment, the next comment, the next comment, and then Facebook defaults to most relevant, and most relevant shifts all the comments around, and it's hard to figure out who said what and who's replying to what. And then the algorithm that shows you what it thinks that you want to see, and it's like, come on, I want to see, I'll be like talking to somebody and they'll say, well, I posted this the other day, and I said, I can't see it. So even if I go to their particular page and click on their profile, I still don't always see everything that they've got posted. It's frustrating as a platform.
Well, something that I think is very interesting is you're in a unique position where, because of your upbringing and your intense interest in the hobby from a young age, you got to kind of see technology change and the different formats of information exchange in this hobby. From when you started to kind of those middle phases, when do you think there was potentially an optimal phase in the hobby, where I think I would break it down towards word of mouth, clubs, literature, forums, you could mix phone calls, forums, and then where we're at now? Where do you think the optimal sweet spot was?
Well,
was there?
when I was when I was an elementary age kid, it was clubs and word of mouth and people reading Right and Right and Keeper and Kept and all of that sort of thing. And most of your information was coming from either word of mouth or clubs or that sort of thing. And then that was pretty prevalent up into the early 90s, like 90, 91, 92. And somewhere in there, I was friends with Jeff Barringer in those days. Um, um, Run into him in West Texas and that sort of thing. The He started the Alterna page, but when the very inception of the Alterna page was, he basically had a spreadsheet online that was who caught what, where, and when. It was the rumor mill on paper, basically, it was on a table format that you could look in at. And of course, people got frustrated, mad at him about publishing the rumor mill, which was, I such and such caught a snake in Iran at such and such time, and so that got taken down. But that was the original inception of the Alterna page, and then we built the Alterna page. If you go and look at the oldest stuff on the Alterna page or the county accounts and stuff, I wrote several of those. Joe Forks wrote a couple, Jeff wrote a couple, and then we all contribute our pictures. Now, back in those days, if you went to West Texas, there were people that carried photo albums around, and I was one of them, where we collected pictures like collecting stamps of Alterna, and you'd sit at the hotel, the one in Sanderson, or one of the ones, the Easter Egg Motel in Terlingua, or whatnot. You sit around the hotel, and during the day, you would flip through the people's photo albums and look at pictures of Alterna. And so the Alterna page kind of grew out of all those photo albums. We had scanners, digital scanners available. We'd scanned our pictures and then posted them up on the Alterna page. And then by, that would have been about 93, 94-ish. And then he instituted forums on the Alterna page. And then he turned it into kingsnake.com and so forth. When the forums were when most of the forums were within the Alterna page and Kingsnake format, I kind of felt like, in retrospect, I kind of feel like that was kind of a, to some degree, some of the old timers that are older than me probably thought that was a disaster because it brought a lot of people out to the Trans-Pecos, but and tell them what roads to go to and where to go and that sort of thing. Certainly, it increased the number of people newbies going out anyway. I mean, there were still a ton of people hunting some of those places where somebody'd catch a snake and find out that somebody caught a snake there, and the cars would flock to that one particular spot. But I don't know that it was that much worse than the rumor mill, but it certainly facilitated the dissemination of information, and it was a very targeted dissemination of information because it was, you know, Gray Banded King Snake Forum, which is what it started as, and then when he made King Snake and he opened up some other forums for other things and that sort of thing, and then he turned it into a way to make a living and sell things and stuff. But when most of the forum discussions were associated directly with King Snake, I think that was probably probably the sweet spot, I guess, of there was information available, it was available, and it was focused on snakes. Once Facebook took off, then you had discussions and you have Facebook groups, but it was outside of the control of, and remains outside of the control of the herping community. It's kind of a parallel with birds. Back in the 80s, you wanted to go see a rare bird, you called a hotline, and the various areas had a hotline. There was a DFW bird alert, there was a Texas rare bird alert, there was a southeastern Arizona rare bird alert. You called that hotline, and if you found a rare bird, you called it and you left a message on their answering machine. And then at the end of each week, somebody would sit down and compile all the rare bird alerts, and so that each week there was an update on that hotline. And then that morphed into, the listservs, where there was an email of that same sort of thing, where you had an email listserv that was sent out. And then when Facebook took off, a lot of the bird alerts drifted over to Facebook. Then, of course, we have eBird now, but most of the discussions have now moved back off of Facebook on birds to various apps, WhatsApp and GroupMe and Discord. I prefer Discord myself, but now most of our discussions have moved back because, if you want timely alerts, the Facebook is horrible because you'll miss stuff. Just like if you're using Facebook to discuss gray banded king snakes and stuff, you'll miss a lot of comments because of the way Facebook filters things and the way the algorithms generate what content you actually see. So you miss a lot of stuff. I'm not sure. I use it and I'm on there, but I'm not. I'm certainly don't like it for bird alerts, and I know that if I'm using it for accessing herp discussions, that I'm probably going to miss stuff, that I wouldn't have missed on the old king snake forums and that sort of thing.
Yes, sir. Yeah. No, and it's a very interesting double-edged sword, right? Where we're at a point in time where there's so much wealth of knowledge, but before there was a barrier to entry, right? Where, someone like yourself, where you put the work in and you put out a just a very educated, informational but digestible material for someone to take that has the interest, that if your interest is invaluable, to soak in if you seek the knowledge, to now where we have something like Facebook where everybody can readily comment on. It removes that barrier for entry, and something like the early days of King Snake where people that were educated were in control of that. Again, there's a barrier of entry there somewhat, and even now in a modern time frame, going back, looking at the Alterna page, that's something that I've referenced a couple years ago. It's a unbelievably in-depth wealth of knowledge. And while you'll hear the disputes of, oh well, was it here, was it there, and from old timers about certain things, the information there is pretty solid, and will give you a good hint on where to start or where to get into. But to the point you made about people earlier on going, are you giving away spots? The alternate community is a peculiar one, and not abnormal in the overall hobby, but very private and very secretive about locality spots. Um,
Well, I would say that the alternative people, though, are actually more open about spots in the sense that we don't have to worry about somebody trashing our spots because it's road cuts, basically.
yes, sir.
Um, you do worry about competition, right? So, I mean, I know people that I know one guy that still advertises his Alterna from the Guads as Culberson County. Um, it's like, okay, there's like 2 roads in the whole county that you can actually hunt Alterna in, and and only one of them is actually likely to produce anything. So you're really not hiding anything. But it's not like Zonata or Pyros, where if you tell somebody where you flipped this Zonata, they're going to show up and crowbar the rocks off the hillside. Or I know a spot up north of Abilene where there's milk snakes that are reasonably common, and a lot of those, they're road cut rocks, but it's flipping spots, and a lot of those rocks have been slid down the hillsides and stuff. And so people that are really serious field collectors are typically a lot more secretive about their spots than Alterna people are. The Zonata people are really secretive about spots because they know if they give away too many spots, so people will come up and trash things. I mean, even me with milk snakes, I've got a spot to look for milk snakes in South Texas that can't stand to be herped more than every couple of years because it's railroad ties that the best ties are embedded within the old railroad gravel. It's a defunct rail line that doesn't have any rails, and the best ties are fairly well seated in the railroad gravel. If you flipped that every year, you would ruin it. You can't flip it more than every couple of years because if you flip those ties up, the ties just loose up on top of the gravel aren't really worth anything, and the ties that are off down in the dirt are not very good. But the best ties are seated in the old gravel. So when you flip it, you have to shove it back down real good, um, and then if somebody went in there carelessly and just flipped everything out, then that spot would be, the milk snakes are still there. They'd just be buried up in the gravel as opposed to being under the ties. So you have to be much more careful with a field collecting spot or a field collecting site than you do with a road cruising site or even hunting road cuts. Now, of course, hunting road cuts, if I catch a snake in the Davis these days, I usually don't tell anybody until I'm done for the season nowadays, or I don't give them specifics. If I'm not going to go back, yeah, I'll tell somebody. But if I'm planning on being out there, I'm going to be out there for a week. I'll usually wait until I'm done before I let the cat out of the bag, as it were, because last thing I want is to see 12 people walking the same cut that I want to walk. So,
Yes, sir. Yeah. Yeah, you'll never see more Alterna than at the end of the year when you can't go find them, and that's when all the cool stuff pops up for sure. And it makes sense, and it's again another double edged sword in Texas field herping, where we do have so much private land. But I think that now where I'm at, and some people adamantly disagree with this, but I would rather have it the way we have it now than we have access to all that private land. I like the idea that there is secure, steady populations that we'll never come in contact with, and we just get this small little segment of it. I'm okay with that.
Well, there's certainly something to be said for that. And but even in uh, I know the Southern California zonata are all protected now. They weren't years ago, and I know when the first time they proposed protecting the parva rubra, the pulchra had been protected since my memory, and I guess that would have been 97 the first time I went out there. But parvs weren't protected. And then they proposed to protect parva rubra sometime in the early 2000s. And I know the late Rick Staub was seeking input on why they shouldn't protect them. And basically, I did some math on the land area that was suitable habitat for zonata, and then the amount of area that was within 1 mile of a paved road. And basically, the argument is that most herpers are lazy and aren't willing to walk more than a mile from pavement, just like most deer hunters and everything else, aren't willing to walk more than a mile from pavement, and that the accessible habitat was so limited that it didn't make a lot of sense to protect them. Now, California has since gone ahead and protected those guys, but that strategy served me in good for when I've gone deer hunting and things like that too, because you go hunt an area that like a wilderness area. I hunted mule deer in New Mexico several years ago, and the guy told me, one of my brother's friends that worked out there said, well, what you want to do is find a pond that's about 2 miles off the road. He said, because most foot hunters, people on foot, aren't willing to walk more than a mile. And most of the guys that take horses go in 5 miles. He said, there's a sweet spot if you're on foot, and that's about 2 miles in. You're farther in than most people are willing to walk, and you're not so far in as the guys that pack in with the horses are willing to go. And I think the same thing's kind of true with herpers. If you go to the Huachucas and you drive into, Scotia or Sunnyside, or on the east side, you go into Ramsey or Miller, you're basically within a mile of a road and where people are willing to hike and stuff. Whereas if you go into some of the little esoteric side canyons that nobody goes into and are willing to hike up off a trail, back into some of the wildernessy type spots, you can find fairly pristine, at least in terms of having been herped, you can find fairly pristine habitat just because most people aren't willing to hike a mile, are even capable of hiking a mile in a lot of cases.
Yes, sir. Yeah. Well, and so something to kind of tangent here, and I'm going to ask you a broad question, and it's kind of out of left field, but I'd be curious to hear your take on it, and just kind of however you break this question down. What are your thoughts, getting back to Alterna, what are your thoughts on hybridation and Alterna? Is that something that you're comfortable to talk about, and kind of what you've seen?
Well, so this is my experience only. Other people might say differently. I don't have good luck breeding Alterna unless I can get them into the 50s. When in the last 5 or 6 years, the years that I've been successful breeding, I've been getting the temps down into the 50s regularly. I'm running an experiment right now. I bought a CoolBot, and my room sits at 52 to 54 constantly right now. I have a separate building. I live in South Texas, so if I run an air conditioner, and I have a window unit and a floor unit, and they both will only cool down to 60. When it gets cold down here, I can get below that. But I think there's two issues with Alterna and temperature. I think if you get them too hot in the summer, then you have issues with reproduction, probably associated with male sperm counts. And if you don't get them cold enough in the winter, I think you have issues. And I'm not sure if it's ovulation or if it's something to do with the cycling in the males and whatnot. Now, I know people that claim that they have good luck breeding Alterna without temperature without dropping them into the 50s. But that doesn't work for me. And I think if you talk to some other folks, I didn't listen to your thing with Brian, and he may have said the same sort of thing. That getting them into the 50s seems to be the sweet spot for them. I know the years that I've had the best luck have been the coldest winters. And I had better luck when I lived in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, and I had colder winters than when I've moved down here. And I've not had as good of a luck. Now, the other side of that coin is that you also have the phenomenon of the recent wild-caught male, right? And I know several people that'll say that their best years breeding is when they've caught a male. And in his first, they caught a male in July, and then the first spring that they had that male, that he's more likely to produce offspring than on a year than after he's been a captive for a while. I've heard that said also. I don't know that I have the statistics to back that up, but it seems likely and seems reasonable that snake hibernated in the wild, or have lived the summer in the wild, and is not subject to the lack of temperature variability that most people's snake houses run on. I think most of us keep our snakes at a certain temperature that we know that they can digest food, and that we've got a hot thing in the back of the cage so that they can sit on it if they want to, or get off of it if they don't. But they don't have the availability of the wide range of temperatures. Those road cuts, we think of how hot it gets out in the Trans-Pecos, but if you get 5 or 6 feet back, the average annual temperature in a lot of the Trans-Pecos is in the 50s or 60s, and they have the opportunity to go, if they want to go deep underground, they could get down. They're not going to get down. They're not going to freeze in the winter, but the underground temperatures are the same thing as the cave temperatures. So for me at Brackettville, the average annual temperature is whatever our spring temperature is, about 72 degrees. In some of the places in the Davis Mountains, the average annual temperature has got to be colder than that, as whatever their spring temperatures are. The springs, the water coming up out of the ground, is in the 60s. So even during the hottest part of the summer, if they want to get to 60 degrees, they can. And we just don't have that option in a building so I think that temperature regimes are important, and we need to do our best to try to mimic their natural temperature regimes, which in the winter is probably means dropping them into the 50s, and during the summer that means that we need to not let them. I know we've probably all caught an Alterna when it was in the 90s. I know I caught a Juno last year that was above 90 when I caught him. But by the same token, I just don't know that. I just feel like that letting him get into the 90s constantly is a problem. Without being able to drop down into cooler temps. So I think you're probably better off if your facility stays in the upper 70s, around 78 to 80 during the daytime, maybe cooling off a little bit at night, and then my dog's trying to get out of the bedroom as we hear that clicking noise.
I'll take care of that if you need to take care of that. That's not a problem.
So that's my thoughts. That's thoughts. It's based upon some experience and evidence and anecdotes from other guys and breeders and stuff. I knew a guy that used to keep his snakes in the garage, and he basically almost never bred anything. Well, he lived in Kansas, and his garage temperatures were in the 90s during the summer. His success breeding was pretty minimal. So.
Yeah, no, 100%. And propagation isn't something that I normally dive deep into, but is something that I've definitely put a lot of thought into. And I'll give you my take on that and an independent kind of just guy off on the side going, I don't know what the hell's going on here. I'll tell you the conclusions I came to, and while very anecdotal, I think in line with your take, and I'd be interested to hear more about that after. Well, excellent. And so I think this is something where we've only scratched the surface of who you are and what makes you tick in the hobby. And I look forward to, hopefully we get to do this again in the future and cover more ground. I know this will be one that I'll be editing and go, oh, I'm such a dummy. I should have asked this and I should have asked that. And I look.
Yeah,
forward
we haven't
to,
even talked about salamanders or I went on a trip to California this past November and was targeting Batrachoceps.
Yes, sir. Yeah. Well, that's what I'm saying. We'll have to do this again in the future if you'd be so kind to do that, and we'll have to cover everything else and write down any little notes you think of. You go, hey, let's talk about this or that because I'm interested in it all, and I appreciate you for your time.
Yeah, no problem. I enjoyed it. So hopefully you get something useful out of that somebody wants to listen to.
Well, I know I will. I know I will listen back to it for sure. Well, excellent. Well, thank you for your time today.
Let me zoom out on you here. Okay, you got a message for the time capsule?
Yeah, and it's simply this. My prediction for you is that even though you'll forget all about this in some way consciously, next summer at about this time, you'll remember to return.